Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to Total War Warhammer. So we're continuing along with our just exploration of the different factions here, and we're up to Greenskins, continuing alphabetically after the Dwarves. Now, Greenskins are one of the better factions, I think, and I think that their roster is one of the better thought out ones. Now, their lords are kind of interesting, and their lack of flyers is kind of interesting, but other than that, they kind of end up in a good situation and a good spot balance-wise. Now, the problem with the Lords is that there's really no reason not to take Azhag the Slaughterer. And if we were to take Azhag and take a look at him by comparison, he's got statistics that are very comparable to the Orc War Boss in terms of melee, but he's got an armor-piercing attack, so on and so forth, and he ends up being very, very similar. Either of these guys could take a Wyvern, but Azhag only costs a few hundred points more to have the same melee statistics, basically, but he's also a caster, so, he's just outright better than an Orc War Boss without costing necessarily that much more. In fact, if you put both of them on the comparative mounts, if you put Skullmuncher on Azhag, and if you put a Wyvern on the Orc War Boss, their points gap actually decreases. So Azhag is just ridiculously potent. He's a really good melee general. He's a really good caster. By the same token, that means that the Goblin Great Shaman, which is an extremely cheap general, just isn't very good because you get a weaker lore of magic than Death lore, and he's really bad at melee combat. Making your general this weak is really a bad choice. The other choice is Grimgor Ironhide, who is better than Azhag the Slaughterer at melee combat, in some respects, but he's not actually capable of being mounted, and he has no real benefits or bonuses compared to Azhag the Slaughterer. Now, he does have your typical lord abilities of Foe Seeker and Stand Your Ground. He's also got Wa, which is plus 34 melee attack and plus 8 leadership. So that area augment ability set is pretty potent on Azhag, but he's not really got anything going for him other than that. So Azhag is just a little bit too good for the roster here. What would probably make sense is reducing his melee statistics and hit points or something like that so that they're a little bit more on par with the caster while keeping him pretty okay at the rest of the stuff, or dramatically increasing his points above that of Grimgor's, because Grimgor Ironhide right now is not really that good. He gets beaten by a couple of the other legendary lords and has no particular redeeming traits that make him superior. Although, his melee attacking 70, I guess, is a really, really good thing, but, it's just not enough to make him worthwhile. You just take Azhag the Slaughterer, you've got the Orc War Boss, you've got a caster, and you've got one of the only units that can fly for the Orcs. Now, next up, you've got the heroes, and Orcs really don't use heroes. You've got the Goblin Big Boss, and this guy's got a Warg or a Giant Spider, so either of those mounts, but his statistics are just quite poor. He doesn't really have anything going for him that makes him good at dealing damage in melee. Now, the fact that he is capable of getting poison attacks can make him pretty okay at dealing damage to people. He can slip into things using the slippery rule, but ultimately his damage just isn't good enough, his defense isn't good enough, his abilities just aren't good enough to make him worth taking. The nice thing about him is that he's very inexpensive, I suppose, but even then, it's just not really that great a character. Next up, you've got the Night Goblin Shaman. This is actually a pretty decent caster if you're not going to take Azhag, or if you don't want to risk Azhag. They can't be mounted on anything, but they've got the ability to take the sort of same spells that we were looking at earlier, but without having to actually be on a big general sort of unit, so he can sort of fling out good spells here. Their sort of lore ability, reduced power recharge rate for enemy wizards, pretty okay lore ability compared to Azhag the Slaughterer. He's got the, of course, Get On With It ability here, which is plus 4% charge bonus for people in a small area around him. I don't remember if he's got the lore bonus, standard lore bonus. I don't think he does, actually. We got the Orc War Boss as well, or sorry, the Orc, where's the Orc Shaman? Oh, Orc Shaman over here. He's got Power of Dewog, improved power recharge rate, so it's the opposite of the Goblin one. And they've got their sort of own lore. They're a lot more durable, but a lot more expensive than the Night Goblin Shaman. I personally actually think the Night Goblin Shaman's a little bit better in some ways. Now, the Lore of Death. This is actually the first time I'm going over the Lore of Death, so we get to talk a little bit about why it's so good. So, Life Leech is here it is, Life Leech. Greatly increases power reserve, greatly improved power recharge rate. That's sort of an ability that lets you cast more magic. They've got the Purple Son of Xerius. It's a vortex. It's not very good. They've got the Aspect of the Dread Knight. Plus 8 leadership can cost terror. It's also not very good. Doom and Darkness. Minus 16 leadership is actually pretty okay. That hex does make it so that the enemy will run off, and then they'll have to sort of rally them or something like that. They've got Soul Blight, which is a pretty okay debuff, but the important thing is they've got Spirit Leech, which is the best assassination spell in the game. It does huge damage to a single target for over 13 seconds, which is like the purpose of this lore. Next up, they got Fate of Bajuna, which is something that you use on large units. It can delete an entire unit of something like Pistoliers in one go, making it a very, very powerful delete unit sort of ability. So they've got 4 crappy spells, but then they've got 2 that are so good that it just makes the entire lore almost mandatory. One of the only things it doesn't do very well is it's not the best buffing or debuffing lore. So if we go to the Night Goblin Shaman, he's got the Little Wog. Sneaky Stabbin is a pretty decent buff. I actually really like the statistics on it. Plus 34 melee attack, plus 18% armor piercing damage. Especially useful because orcs don't have the best armor piercing damage on their weapons. But since it's percent based, it's also kind of not great in that sense there. So if we were to look at, for example, the biguns, armor piercing damage of 12. So it's still pretty good, but it's not great. Savage Orc biguns, 12 again. It's the Black Orcs that gain the biggest benefit, but they already benefit highly from it. Or they already have a ton of it, so it's not as important for them. 9 over for these guys, and so on and so forth. So, Sneaky Stabbin is a pretty decent buff. It makes your offense really, really good and lets you crack through units that you might not otherwise be able to make it through. I actually quite like it. Itchy Nuisance is the inverse of it, minus 22% weapon damage and minus 34 weapon melee attack. Not as good as Sneaky Stabbing in my opinion. I think that the orcs benefit more from increasing their own offensive capabilities as opposed to decreasing the enemy's offensive capabilities because they're kind of percent based other than the melee attack one. Although reducing units' melee attack to 0 can really just make it really rough for your opponent to win in a fight, and the long duration does also work out quite well. So you could use this against something like Ironbreakers. Your units will slowly poke at them while the Ironbreakers basically can't hit back because their low melee attack means that they're not really doing anything. But, you know, then the hex ends and then you start losing again. The effect radius of these is identical, so it depends on sort of the situation which you would use. Next up is Gorkle Fix-It. You basically cast it on an enemy and it reduces their speed. It's not a particularly good debuff, but it does last for a long time. You could use it to catch up to something that's trying to run away. Next up, you've got Night Shroud, minus 20% accuracy, minus 24% visibility range. It's good hex against enemy ranged units, but not ideal. I don't think that the accuracy stat actually works as a huge deterrent to ranged units because they usually are aiming at large formations. Minus 24% visibility range is also very, very unimportant in this game. Next, you've got the Vindictive Glare. This is a decent actual magic missile. You can use it to target out generals and assassinate them if you don't want to use Azhag, and it works at a longer range as well. So it can be a fairly effective ability as far as that goes. Next up is Curse of the Bad Moon. This is actually the best vortex in the game because it has such a strong contact effect. It not only does relatively decent damage for a vortex, but if you can get it to start hitting enemy units, that minus 34 melee attack, minus 15 armor, minus 24% speed is a really big disruption effect. So it can actually be quite useful, but it is very, very random as to whether it's going to like crawl back into your own units or not. And it can actually really screw you over quite badly because of that. Lastly, they've got Madcap Mushrooms, minus 30 ability recharge. So this does increase your miscast chance. It's not a particularly great ability. It doesn't do anything to recharge their pool, so they do lack that ability. Next up, we got the Orc Shaman. They've got the Fist of Gork, big bonus to melee attack, defense, and weapon damage. So this is one of the biggest, strongest augments out there. Good duration, pretty high mana cost, but that's fine. The Fist of Gork is just a very, very strong ability. Next up, you got Here We Go, plus 58 melee attack. Not actually sure why they've got this, because usually I find that Fist of Gork is stronger. The huge bonus to melee attack sort of has a diminishing return, so increasing melee defense and weapon damage is probably better. Gaze of Mork, it's a magic missile, it's pretty effective. Similar to what the Goblin was using. You've got Brain Busta, it's basically an explosion type one. It's a little bit kind of bad, like most area effect ones, but it's very, very cheap. You've got Edbutt, which is, again, a area effect breath weapon. It's not particularly great, doesn't deal very much damage. And then you've got Foot of Gork, which is another strike area one. Again, not particularly good. They have got like probably one of the best, well, probably the best buff spell in the game, Fist of Gork. It's pretty much the only reason to take these guys, as well as the Gaze of Mork, using that to maim enemy generals if you can get a shot against them. It does quite a lot of damage to them, so it could be used for assassination. But other than that, that's all of the Orc heroes. Basically, you want to take Azhag the Slaughterer, and then you could take a shaman of some sort if you really wanted to. Next up, we got the infantry. You got the Goblins, who are a shielded expendable unit. They've got spears, but for some reason don't have a bonus versus large. Maybe it's because their spears are so short. Now, they are very, very cheap, but they have very, very poor statistics all in all. Their leadership is actually higher than a lot of the Bretonnian units, but their stats they aren't actually good at anything in particular. So I tend not to really take these things other than as potentially a missile shield. Basically, you send them out to screen against attacks of whatever sort, because they do have a fairly large missile block chance, and you could use them to potentially soak up all of the missile attacks that your enemy has, maybe. I don't really know. Next up, you've got Night Goblins. They're a variation of the Goblin with lower leadership, catastrophically lower, in fact, that has poisonous melee attacks. So they can be used to disrupt an enemy unit. They cost quite a bit for that purpose, though, and don't have very good melee statistics themselves. They're not terrible, but their lack of armor really does hurt them quite badly. Again, they're very good at blocking missiles, however. They've got Night Goblin Fanatics. It's a variation of the previous, except they've got a special ranged weapon that will go flying essentially out of the unit. That does basically long damage. It's only got a 12-second duration. It's strong versus multiple units. Small moving area effect. Causes armor-piercing damage. It's not necessarily the most reliable of things, and they can only use it a few times, but this can devastate an enemy unit, and then you could follow through with a poison. But their lower statistics and relatively high cost, 450 for the stat line, is not great. Means that they're not going to typically win in combat once that happens. Next up, you got the Orc Boys. These guys are pretty solid, decent missile block chance, okay armor. They're pretty comparable to the Empire Swordsmen. They tend to not be hugely improved over units like that, but they've got good weapon strength and melee attack. What's nice about them is their huge number of hit points, they're relatively low cost, so they're not terrible as a unit, but they're not great either. Next up, you've got the Savage Orcs. These guys have Frenzy and Warpaint, so they have a slight resistance to damage, physical resistance 20%. And, that can actually let them last pretty long times against certain things. They've got no armor, they've got very high weapon strength, and melee attack but low melee defense, meaning that they die relatively quickly, especially against units that are very good against infantry. They die even faster against things like Grail Knights. If they get it charged by those, they're in serious, serious trouble. But their damage is very, very high, and their price point is pretty low, so they can be good as a shock troop sort of thing, especially on the charge. Their charge bonus is very, very high, and they've got the Frenzy, which gives them that extra melee attack when their leadership is still high. Next up, you've got the Orc Biguns. These are the unit that I prefer using. Their weapon strength is quite good. Bonus versus large, meaning that they're quite good against cavalry as well. They've got good armor without being really high. Their leadership is actually quite reliable and solid. Their melee attack is high. Their melee defense is okay, and they've got a decent charge bonus. Nothing special about them other than that they've got very, very good statistics. A lot of hit points for the unit as well makes them quite good. You've got Savage Orc Biguns, who are the Savage Orc variant of that. They've got the Damage Dealer trait and the Bigger in Ardor, similar to the difference between Boys and Savage Orcs. So these guys similarly have the bonus versus large, giving them a very, very good weapon damage value against those sorts of things. Their melee attack is very high, their melee defense is very low, their charge bonus is very, very high. These guys are very good against a lot of different types of targets, but again, they're not particularly good at dealing with armored units. Armor-piercing damage of 12 is actually quite good, but it's not really cost-effective necessarily, and as well, their complete lack of armor leaves them quite vulnerable, even though they've got that physical resistance of 20%. There's a lot of situations where that's simply not sufficient. The Frenzy is quite nice, though, meaning that they've got that additional melee attack, goes up all the way to 50, that's very, very high. So they can tear through units quite effectively for their cost point. Next up, you got the Black Orcs. These are one of the best armored units in the game. They come in a fairly small unit, but they've got really high melee attack, really good armor, really good leadership, and really good weapon strength, 42. They will have to rely on their charge, though, to a certain extent, because their charge bonus is very high. They're immune to psychology, and they've got a huge hit point pool. Now, they aren't as good as something like the Hammerers, but they will beat most other armored units in the game. They're very good at taking out dwarves, but they're not necessarily the most cost-effective out there. So if they're stuck fighting things that are not armored, unlike the Longbeards for the dwarves, they're not really cost-effective enough to win out in a fight against that sort of situation. So Black Orcs are really great in a lot of situations, and people tend to take quite a few of them, but you have to be careful, because you find yourself fighting things that are not armored, that do have armor piercing, like say Hex Wraiths. These guys are going to be just a terrible value proposition. Next up, you got the Missile Infantry, you got the Goblin Archers to start off with. These guys, unfortunately, only have 110 range, otherwise they would be quite good. Their missile damage is lower, but their very, very low price point makes it so that they could potentially be worthwhile. If the enemy is otherwise engaged, it doesn't matter as much that your range is shorter, though, since you won't necessarily be using these guys in a skirmisher versus skirmisher long-range fight. They can be kind of effective, though their missile damage is lower than average for a ranged unit, so you do have to keep that in mind. Night Goblin variant, same sort of thing, although poisoned attacks with their missiles and melee attacks makes them so that they can sort of support, although if you're firing into melee, then you're going to be causing trouble to your own guys as well. Now, these guys have much lower leadership, so these guys you have to be really, really careful about how you use them. And the fact that their poison doesn't necessarily last too long, only 5 seconds, means that you're going to be not getting the most benefit out of that, by contrast to using a melee Night Goblin unit. Next up are the Orc Error Boys. These guys have your more typical range, but it's still lower. It's 135 with decent missile damage and so on and so forth. Now, this is the same range as guns, but they've got better damage profiles than guns against unarmored units, so you can use them for that purpose. Their melee stats, just like the Dwarven ones, are okay, but I would argue that the Dwarves are a little bit better at melee than these guys. But all in all, like they're a pretty okay ranged unit. I wouldn't underestimate the Orc Error Boys. Next up, you got the Night Goblin Archers with Fanatics. They get the ability to launch those Fanatics at enemies that sort of close to them. What you can do is you can sort of zone out your own archers this way by having, if an enemy charges, for example, into you with, say, Knights or something like that, like Demigryphs or whatever, then the spinning loons, the Night Goblin Fanatics, will just basically whirl out of there and start trashing them up a little bit. And while they're being poisoned, you know, you'll have a little bit more time to deal damage to them. So it can actually be effective to have those, but I find that they're not worth the price. 550 is pretty expensive for a ranged unit that's not very good at ranged attacks. Next up, you got the Savage Orc Error Boys. They've got decent range again, decent missile damage, same as those other guys. Now, again, they will lose the skirmisher fight just because of that lack of range, but it's not too bad. They can still be used against something like gunners relatively effectively. Again, these guys are just very good at melee combat. They've got war paint, which can be sometimes useful, but not on an archery unit in my opinion, so you're going to quite often want to just stick with the Orc Error Boys. They're cheaper, and you don't need the statistics that you find on the Savage Orc Error Boys. And the 30 armor is, I think, a little bit more reliable than the war paint. So, moving on from them, you've got the Goblin Wolf Riders as the first cavalry unit. Now, this is one of the best light cavalry units in the game, just because their cost is so low. And they do perfectly well at sort of hitting enemy archers and other light targets like artillery or something like that. They're very, very fast. 94 speed is fast enough to catch virtually anything in the game. And their statistics are very, very low, so they will lose out against certain things like, for example, Orc archers can give them a bit of a hard time, and they do very poorly against something like Dwarven crossbowmen, but like they're so much cheaper than them that tying them up and actually getting a decent number of kills against them with a good charge does actually make a big difference in a fight. So next up are the Forest Goblin Spider Riders. I actually quite like these guys for the poison delivery. If I'm going to take poison, this is what I like. Their melee attack is quite solid with poison effect. They've got decent all-around statistics, and they're quite okay as a cavalry flanking unit. But unlike the Goblin Wolf Riders, they're not really a fast cavalry unit for flanking or for attacking enemy missile units. They're more for supporting in a fight, getting around the sides of the big melee blob, and adding in those poison attacks and the debuff from having an enemy around your back. The fact that they've got Strider, ignoring penalty from terrain, means that they're very, very good at that role. But they're not necessarily the best frontline combatant either. Next up, you got the Orc Boar Boys. These guys for cavalry are fairly inexpensive at 750, but their statistics don't really dazzle or anything. Their melee attack and their weapon strength, not particularly good. They do have armor piercing damage, but it's just not very high damage or anything like that. You could use these things in a pinch against things like dwarves, I suppose, but their statistics are just so low that they're not going to cause huge amounts of kills. The only reason that you really want these guys is that they're very economical. 750 is very, very cheap for a cavalry unit with a good charge bonus, so they're pretty good as far as that goes. You've got the Savage Orc variant of that, armor piercing and anti-infantry again. They've got the sort of frenzy ability, making them a little bit better in melee combat. That melee attack is actually more like 32. You can get in, get the charge, deal a lot of damage against something pretty effectively, so that makes them pretty okay shot cavalry for their price point. Then you got the Orc Boar Boy biguns, and let's go ahead and start deleting some of this stuff here. So Orc Boar Boy biguns, these guys, just a slightly more interesting one. They've got a bonus versus large, and they've got heavy armor piercing damage, making them very, very good night hunters. They can win in a lot of cavalry versus cavalry fights, although their general statistic and stat line is so low that they can also lose in cavalry versus cavalry fights. They rely kind of on that very good charge bonus that they've got there, but if they end up getting in a fight against something like, say, Bretonnian Knights of the Realm, the statistics disparity is so bad that they could potentially still lose that fight. Next up, you got the Orc Boar Chariot. Haven't really figured out a way to use this effectively, but their bonus versus infantry is very, very high. Their shock value with the charge is the highest in the game, basically. So they can deal a ton of damage on that charge. I just haven't really figured out a way to get that reliably happening over and over again, because their damage otherwise is just not particularly special. Next up, you got the Savage Orc Boar Boy biguns, and these guys, for some reason, lose the anti-large trait, which I thought was a little bit odd. I suppose it's because they've got different weapons, but they've got huge damage again, huge melee attack when they're using frenzy, and I guess that the combination of having a little bit of armor along with the physical resistance makes them kind of durable, but they're pretty expensive for something that's not really a whole lot better, and in many ways is worse than the Orc Boar Boy biguns. Honestly, I would just take the Orc Boar Boy biguns because they can work cavalry versus cavalry quite effectively, and they've still got a decent charge shock attack. If you look at them as a shock cavalry, their charge bonus is still very high. So I think that the Orc cavalry is relatively weird. A lot of it is strangely priced. Not very many of it is good in the current context of the game, but the bonus versus armor and versus large makes them occupy a sort of unique space that most cavalry don't have the ability to fill the role of. So they could be very, very useful in those sort of roles. And you could think of even the Orc Boar Boy biguns as monster hunter type units. Very, very effective at that sort of role because of the bonus versus large being quite high. Damage being a total of 42 versus large targets, which is quite good, actually. The only problem that their melee attack being so low means they might have some trouble struggling to hit it. Next up, we got Missile Cavalry. We've got the Goblin Wolf Rider Archers. Decent sort of very, very cheap unit there that's capable of getting in damage while being extremely, extremely fast and annoying. If they get caught, they're completely trashed, but they're quite good at what they do, harassing and getting around the enemy's flanks and being really inexpensive at it, and you can throw them into enemy artillery if the need arises. Next up, you got the Forest Goblin Spider Rider Archers. These guys I actually think are worse than the Goblin Wolf Rider Archers because they're slower, and that speed is such an important thing for missile unit, mounted missile unit as well. So the fact that they have poison doesn't really apply too much because typically you're not going to be hitting a unit and then getting into a fight with them right away. Now, the minus 24% speed means that if you're being chased by a single unit and you're using this Goblin Spider Rider Archers, that will really mess with that chase, so they will be useful in that context. But other than that, that's not particularly a useful ability. Especially if they're chasing you with 2 units, they'll be able to catch you with one of them quite probably. Next up, you got the Goblin Wolf Chariot, and this is a ranged missile chariot. It's got a really quite decent amount of damage on the charge, surprisingly, and I'm not entirely sure what they're for. The missile attack on this is quite bad just because you've only got 6 of them, so it's going to be plunking away with its arrows constantly, but it won't be doing that much damage. But it does have a really, really quite decent charge just because there's so much unit mass to it that when it's moving at full speed, charging in through infantry, it can deal a decent amount of damage, and it's not that expensive. It is relatively fragile, however, meaning that if it gets bogged down at all, it will die. It's not very tough. In fact, counter archery fire or artillery even can destroy these quite quickly. Next up, you've got the monsters for the Orcs, and the Orcs have sort of weird monsters. They're not necessarily the best up until you get to the Arachnarok. They've got basic trolls, and these things do suffer from, as they mentioned, poor leadership. And the problem with these guys is that they will run before they've managed to do very much of their damage. Their melee defense is low, their armor is low, so what happens is they get the charge in, which is quite good. They've got a very high charge bonus and very high weapon damage, but their melee attack is only mediocre. And they'll deal a little bit of damage and then they'll run away. Now, this sort of works in their favor because of the regeneration factor. They'll run away, regenerate their health back, and then run back into combat. And, okay, that sort of works, but it's not really enough to keep them in a fight long enough to deal damage in most situations. So there's a lot of times where trolls just aren't particularly good at what they're supposed to be doing. Next up, you got the Giant, and again, this is a sort of weird unit. It doesn't suffer from that leadership problem. As you can see, it's got very, very good leadership. But it's got 30 armor and is a very easy to hit model, so if the enemy is throwing things at it, it will die very, very quickly. It will deal a lot of damage, though, before it goes down. It does have huge damage values. It has really good melee attack. It has a good charge bonus. So its huge hit point pool, even though it'll go down very, very quickly, means it's going to be sponging up a lot of attacks while causing a good amount of damage. It's just that it does die very, very quickly. And it doesn't have really necessarily the best trade-off values against other opponents because of its high cost. So it can be useful, but rarely is. It just dies a little bit too quickly. Next up, we got the Arachnarok Spider. This actually is a very good monster. It's got 2,000 point unit, which might sound too high, but its poison attacks mean that enemies are going to have a very hard time actually cracking through it because it reduces that armor piercing damage by quite a bit. It has a lot of armor. 150 armor is huge. It has decent speed. It's got really good weapon strength. Guys on top of it are going to be plunking away with their arrows at anything that gets near it that isn't being attacked by an enemy, causing poison to them as well, with high missile damage as well. So you end up with this monster that does everything a little bit and does it all pretty well. The only problem with it, again, is its high point cost, but I've seen it being useful despite its points cost quite often. It is a very tough beast to kill. For artillery, the Orcs have the Goblin Rock Lava. Typical sort of Rock Lava statistics, or catapult statistics. Lower range for some reason than a lot of them. A lot of them have 420 range, it only has 380. So it's kind of bad for that reason, but it is very, very cheap as a result. The crew of it is one of the most vulnerable ones I've ever seen, so it does suffer from quite a lot of flaws, but it's so cheap that it could be potentially worthwhile. Next, you got the Doomdiver Catapult. It's got 400 range, so it's a little bit lower than a lot of other things. Now, the nice thing about the Doomdiver Catapult is that the unit hitbox is so tiny that it's very, very hard to hit with counter-artillery. And despite what it says, the missile damage for this does seem to actually deal a lot of damage to armored units, killing them quite effectively. So these guys are actually a fairly decent siege weapon, relatively inexpensive, high accuracy, very, very good at taking out large groups of infantry. So that's sort of the Orc roster. You'll notice that they have really no options for flight, and they've got few options that are really effective at range. They're sort of more based around their high-value melee infantry, sort of, in my opinion. Now, they have got some other things that they can do, and they've got some cheeky tricks that they can pull off, especially with things like Goblin Wolf Riders being fairly effective, but there's a lot about the Orcs that kind of makes them very, very effective. That's ranging from the fact that they've got decent statistics all around, the fact that they've got different answers to different things, and makes it a little bit hard to predict what you're going to be up against when you're facing off against Orcs. Let's go ahead and look for a match here and hope that we get a good one here. Hopefully it won't be another mirror match, because those are awful. Alright. And let's see what we want to do here. Alright, so we want to go with Azhag the Slaughterer. I'm not sure if we want to have him on Skullmuncher. We're up against Undead, so we definitely don't want him up there. We're going to go ahead and get a bunch of the Orc biguns. And the reason that I want mostly Orc biguns is because my opponent is very likely to take a lot of monsters, and that's really what they take. So the fact that I've got bonuses versus that is going to be quite helpful. We'll want a couple of the Error Boys, I think, just so I can fire upwards if I have to. We'll take a couple of the Forest Goblin Riders there. And we'll go ahead and take an Arachnarok Spider. I feel like that is actually quite good here. And we've still got some points left over, so why don't we go ahead and take one of these, drop one of those, drop one of these, and get another Black Orc. So we got something that can take out Graveguard. And then we can go ahead and look at another cavalry unit, maybe. let's actually get rid of one of these and then take a unit of these guys. There we go. So got that in just under the wire. So we got a fairly decent line of infantry there, along with Azhag. It's going to make it hard for them to actually assassinate my general, because I'm going to be able to plunk at their general if he comes in close with both my own Spirit Leech as well as the Night Goblin, because the Night Goblin can fire off his magic missile against him from very long range, dealing good damage to single targets. Now, I might miss a lot, but that is what happens sometimes. Hopefully we'll get good hits, though. In addition, like if he gets too close, I can use those Arc Arrow Boys to try and do some range damage to them, and I can just follow along underneath the Arachnarok Spider, a very tough, tanky unit that he'll probably have to focus on a little bit more than he might want to. What's nice about the Arachnarok Spider as well is it is pretty good against things like Cryptorus, just because it kills them in such a short time that the regeneration doesn't really proc. Although they're quite effective against it as well because it's heavily armored. But yeah, hopefully the big Orc biguns will be a good counter to a lot of the things that you might expect the undead to take. We'll probably have to use things like Black Orcs against zombies, though, because I do want to keep the Orc biguns untied up so that they can flank and attack enemy monsters, although if they've got... do the typical thing of like zombies and then Cryptors, the Orc biguns actually being near the front is probably the best way we can do it. They're a great counter to that type of unit, because they're not armored, meaning that that armor-piercing attack goes a bit to waste. Got very good damage against them, so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and line these guys up here. We'll actually have them front and center, and we'll support with Black Orcs in the event that we see lots of Graveguard. Otherwise, we'll have these guys as a sort of monster hunting squad. Let's go ahead and bring these Azhag over here, along with our Goblin Shaman. We'll have these guys ready to flank, as well as our Arachnarok Spider. Alright, so let's see what our opponent's done here. Yeah, he's got nothing but line after line of Skeleton Warrior, followed by the Cryptors, because like I said, Cryptors right now are broken as shit, but 2 flying vampires trying to do assassination runs is my guess. So here's the thing, the Savage Orcs are going to be capable of holding the front line pretty okay against the Cryptors. In particular, if I can get shots off with those Arrow Boys, they'll be doing okay against Cryptors in this situation. Alright, so he's splitting off to my flanks there. So we're going to go ahead and bring these guys around, these guys up front. Get Savage Orcs over here. Now, the reason I'm holding center line with these, with the units that I'm holding it with, the Black Orcs, is because the skeletons can't really do that much damage to them. So them getting tied up would be less bad in this context than other situations. Go. And we'll charge these guys into there. And we'll charge these guys into there. So we'll leave our Arachnarok Spider otherwise unengaged. We'll go ahead and charge these guys into the Cryptors over here. And we'll assist with these sort of little guys here. Spirit Leech on their general. See if I can wait till that guy's stopped moving there a little bit. Now, he's using his assassination building abilities on my general, which, you know, fair enough, I'm using them against him as well. There we go. Alright, we're going to start firing at these guys over here. Start using our abilities again against these guys. If we can hit this guy with this lucky shot here, then we're going to be able to win, basically, right off that. Alright. Gonna run Azhag into combat. Yeah, we've killed their general. So, very, very strong assassination spells that I've been using. Now, the reason I ran the spiders into this fight is so that the crypt horrors are suffering from the poison debuff, which has been really affecting them quite badly. We're gonna move these guys down here. Can move. He's not even gonna have to, I don't think. Alright, Azhag, let's go ahead and, well, I don't even really know. Alright, let's try to get these guys over into, those crypt horrors so that they can't get into my archers that easily. Ragnarok's spider is doing quite well for itself, I think. Now, we can't really regain much magic at this point in time, but that's fine. I don't really have to worry about that too badly. Their vampire is coming in for another pass or something, I don't really know what. But at this point in time, it's pretty much done for his army. Now, he has still got some crypt horrors in my backline here, fighting my Ragnarok spider as well, but that is okay. Still trying to assassinate Azhag here, but it doesn't really matter that much. He's lost so many of his units that, well, actually, let's bring these guys across this way. Yeah, the Ragnarok spider has not taken any damage at all, really, against these guys. Just tearing these undead apart, absolutely. Bring these guys back into the fight, why not? And, looks like Azhag is either dead or running. Looks like he's running. Okay, well, whatever. Perfectly fine with that. We're just going to continue firing arrow shots at this stupid wizard up here. And his army's going to start crumbling pretty soon here. There's not much left that he can do. Alright, so those guys are all dead now. His vampire has completely crumbled now. And yeah, that's going to be the whole army. Pretty much gone. Azhag's still barely alive. And yeah, this was a pretty effective counter to what my opponent had taken. He was really hoping to assassinate my lord really, really quickly. But it cost him his in the exchange, and mine barely lived, in fact. The skeletons were supposed to hold up my units, and they did a good job of holding up high-value black orcs, which I wouldn't normally want fighting skeletons, but in this case that is a good solution because their ability to fight armored opponents is really poor on the skeleton's part. Crypt horrors got countered by the by the orc biguns. The orc biguns are just supremely good against things like crypt horrors. Their value against them is so very, very good. Managing to get around there with the Ragnarok spider, tear through them as well, really managed to help out. So that was all in all a very, very successful battle using the orcs' biggest strengths against some of the most powerful units that the undead really have to offer, although he did spend far too many points on upgrades for those skeletons. Now, if you don't really want to assassinate your opponent's generals, then you could avoid taking the Night Goblin Shaman, and you could take something like the Orc War Boss. Very, very cost effective if you're sort of going that route, especially if you're staying on land, but against undead it's going to be something you're going to want to take. My opponent should have looked at my roster and been immediately dissuaded from going near me to try and assassinate Azhag. He should have looked at it and realized that I would be able to win that particular exchange because the Night Goblin Shaman is actually a little bit better at assassinating generals than a vampire is, because his abilities are a little bit cheaper. If you were to look at Vindictive Glare, it's pretty cheap, and it's really good damage, and it is very, very effective at that sort of situation. And it's longer range, so I'm going to be able to start firing a little bit earlier, and you know, once he gets close, I can use Spirit Leech at the same time as he's using it, dealing that sort of damage to him as well, and it ends up being a little bit more than he can take with his general. By contrast, you know, the two vampires, they have to run in much, much closer before they can afford to use Spirit Leech twice. And by then I've hit them a bunch of times with the missile units as well, so that combination just means that that assassination is not successful. So yeah, that's essentially orcs. It's important to know what units to take against what sort of counter units. Black orcs against sort of like Graveguard, for example, would be very, very important, and you have to know that they might take some of those, so you might take some black orcs. You know, the orc biguns are amazing against large targets like my opponent had, so these guys are very, very good against those sort of things. You want to take something like the Ragnarok Spider if you want to. It's just a very solid monster, one of the best in the game. And you want to take, you know, whatever else you want to take, because the orcs have a varied and large, interesting roster of things that are fun to take. I think that's sort of one of the things that makes them the best factions in the game. So anyway, I hope you found this enjoyable, and of course, as always, I hope to see you all next time.